The Cheyenne Bank and Trust was a temple built to the god of numbers, all cold marble and polished brass, smelling of oiled wood and the dry rustle of currency. Garrett Sullivan felt the chill of it in his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter raging outside. He stood before the manager's desk, his hat held respectfully in his work-roughened hands, his posture straight and proud, despite the slow, crushing weight of the words being spoken to him. Thomas Blackwell, the bank's manager, was a man meticulously assembled from a catalog of Eastern propriety. His suit was perfectly tailored, his mustache precisely trimmed, and his eyes held the flat, dispassionate gleam of a man who saw life as a series of figures on a ledger. "I'm afraid sentiment doesn't factor into these calculations," Mr. Sullivan Blackwell said, his voice as smooth and unforgiving as glacial ice. He tapped a manicured finger on the loan document separating them. The terms were clear. The payment is due. An extension under the current circumstances of the ranch's fluctuating profitability would be imprudent. Fluctuating, Garrett's voice was low, a rumble of controlled frustration. "My prize bull is sick, Mr. Blackwell. A temporary setback. The new calves are strong. The spring melt guarantees water for the summer. The ranch is sound. The numbers suggest otherwise." Blackwell's smile was a thin, bloodless line. "Your debt-to-asset ratio is concerning, and I have a fiduciary duty to the bank's investors." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Frankly, Garrett, I'm doing you a kindness. Victor Reynolds has made another offer for your northern pastures. A generous one. Enough to clear your debt entirely and leave you with a substantial surplus. You could consolidate, retrench. It's the smart play." The mention of Reynolds' name was like a spark to dry tinder. Garrett's jaw tightened, the muscles along his neck cording. The Sullivan Ranch is not for sale. Not 1 acre. Not now, not ever. Pride is a luxury, Sullivan. One you can no longer afford. Blackwell straightened, his brief pretense of camaraderie gone. "The payment is due in 30 days. If it is not met in full foreclosure proceedings on the northern section, including all water rights to Sullivan Creek, will commence immediately. Good day." Dismissed, Garrett turned and walked out of the bank, the polished doors closing behind him with a soft, final click. Outside, the wind shrieked like a banshee, driving splinters of ice against his face. He pulled his hat down low, his blue eyes narrowed against the blizzard. 30 days. It was an impossible deadline. Losing the northern pastures meant losing the creek, and losing the creek meant the slow death of everything his father had built, everything he had sworn to protect. He looked down the street, his gaze falling on the train station just a few hundred feet away, its windows glowing like warm, distant stars in the swirling chaos of the storm. Inside that very station, another life was being dismantled by the same cold arithmetic of fate. Eleanor Sinclair stepped from the warmth of the train car onto the windswept platform, the sudden shock of the cold taking her breath away. Snowflakes, delicate and cruel, immediately began to cling to the fine wool of her traveling suit. She clutched the collar of her coat tighter, her other hand instinctively going to the silver locket that rested against her heart. It was a gift from Thomas. His first. He had sent it to her in Boston a year ago, its polished surface cool and promising beneath her fingers. As the wind howled around her, she closed her eyes for a fleeting second, letting a memory flash through her mind, vivid and hopeful. She saw his elegant handwriting on thick cream stationery, his words painting a future of comfort, respect, and shared intellectual pursuits in the burgeoning heart of the West. "Cheyenne is a city of limitless potential, my dearest Eleanor." He had written, "And you are the only thing missing to make my life here complete." A porter, his face red and chapped by the wind, deposited her trunk on the platform beside her. "Telegram for a Miss Sinclair," he grunted, handing her a flimsy yellow envelope before hurrying back into the relative shelter of the station. Her heart gave a little flutter of excitement. Thomas must have been delayed. He was telling her where to meet him. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the seal. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the curt black letters printed on the page. "LLNR? The engagement is cancelled. Don't come. Fortune lost. Nothing left to offer. Thomas." The world seemed to tilt and blur. The shrieking wind faded to a dull roar in her ears. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the carefully constructed edifice of her future. 8 words. 8 words that had transformed her from a hopeful bride-to-be into a woman abandoned, stranded 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known. She read them again, and then a third time, as if repetition could somehow alter their meaning. It could not. The silver locket suddenly felt impossibly heavy against her chest, its promise turned to a mocking weight. Just a few hundred feet away, in a warm, polished office, the man who had penned those devastating words was methodically dismantling another family's future, oblivious to the wreckage he had just created on a snowy train platform. The blizzard raged, swirling around the 2 solitary figures, caught in its vortex, their separate storms of despair destined to collide. The station master's words were a death knell to her last desperate hope. "Last eastbound train's been cancelled, miss. This storm's blown in faster than expected. Won't be another train until the weather clears. Days, maybe." Eleanor nodded, and the motion, stiff disconnected from the numb chaos in her mind. The Silver Creek Hotel, she managed her voice barely a whisper above the wind. The man's weathered face creased with pity. "Filled to the rafters, I'd wager. Every stranded soul in Cheyenne is looking for a room tonight." He was right. The hotel lobby was a throng of damp wool and loud voices. The clerk, harried and impatient, barely glanced at her. $2, ma'am, in advance." She opened her small reticule, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She counted out her remaining money. $1.75. The train ticket, purchased with 4 years of careful savings, had taken almost everything. I only have $1.75, she admitted, the words tasting of ash and humiliation. The clerk's expression hardened. "Sorry, ma'am. $2 is the price." He turned to the next person in line, dismissing her as easily as Thomas had. Defeated, she retreated into the storm. The wind tore at her, pulling the pins from her hair, its icy breath finding every gap in her clothing. There was nowhere else to go. She made her way back to the station, the only shelter she could claim. The waiting room was a microcosm of humanity, thrown together by the Storm families, with fretful children, solitary salesmen, cowboys, whose boisterous energy was slowly being dampened by the endless waiting. Eleanor found a small corner of a bench, pulling her trunk close, trying to make herself invisible. Hours bled into one another. The crowd thinned as townsfolk offered shelter to families, and single men drifted off toward the dim, smoky lights of the saloons. By midnight, only a handful of souls remained scattered amongst the hard wooden benches. The iron stove in the center of the room glowed a malevolent red, its heat barely reaching the corners where the cold seeped through the walls. Eleanor sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, a portrait of Boston propriety that felt absurdly out of place. But the posture was a shield, a last defense against the terror that was beginning to claw at her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The carefully planned future, the escape from a life of genteel poverty as a teacher, had evaporated. For the first time since her parents' deaths years ago, she bowed her head, and a single hot tear traced a path down her frozen cheek. Then another. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking with a grief too profound for sound. The station clock chimed 1, its metallic clang echoing in the nearly empty room. A sudden gust of wind and snow announced a new arrival as the main door burst open. Two small figures, identical bundles of energy with copper-red hair escaping from beneath their bonnets, darted inside their laughter, peeling through the quiet despair of the room. "Clara, Charlotte, come back here this instant." A deep voice, rich with exasperation and affection, followed them in. A tall man filled the doorway, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his mouth that suggested a life of both hardship and laughter. But it was his eyes that arrested her, a startling, piercing blue, the color of a mountain lake. And they were filled with a weary concern as he scanned the room for his errant daughters. One of the girls, spotting Eleanor, made a beeline for her bench. Before Eleanor could react, the child had scrambled up beside her, giggling breathlessly. Found a hiding place, she declared to her sister, who promptly followed suit, climbing onto Eleanor's other side, sandwiching her between two small, warm bodies. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am." The man reached them in 3 long strides. His gaze took in the scene, the two girls nestled against a woman in a fine traveling suit, tear tracks visible on her pale cheeks, a telegram still clutched in her hand. Understanding dawned in those blue eyes, followed by a flicker of sympathy he quickly masked. "Girls, this is no way to behave. Leave the lady in peace." "It's quite all right," Eleanor found herself saying, her voice hoarse. "No harm done." "But Papa, we just got warm," protested the one on her left. "And the lady smells nice," added her sister. "Like flowers, not like cows." Despite everything, a faint smile touched Eleanor's lips. The man looked mortified. "Clara," he admonished gently. "Manners." The station master emerged from his office. "Mr. Sullivan, there you are. Mighty late to be out with the little ones." He glanced from Garrett to Eleanor. "Miss here's been stranded by the storm. Was supposed to meet her fiancé." He gestured vaguely at the telegram, his meaning clear. "Hotels are all full up." Eleanor felt a hot flush of shame. Her private tragedy had become public spectacle. She lifted her chin. "I will manage, thank you." Mr. Sullivan studied her for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his face. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I'm Garrett Sullivan. I own a cattle ranch about 20 miles out of town. It seems you're in a difficult position. I came to town today to inquire about a governess for my daughters." Eleanor stared at him, speechless. He gestured to the twins who were watching the exchange with wide, identical blue eyes. "They lost their mother 2 years ago. They need proper guidance and education." His gaze met hers directly. "You look like an educated woman, Miss Sinclair. If you're stranded here with no immediate prospects, perhaps we could come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. Room and board plus a fair wage in exchange for teaching my daughters." The proposition was outrageous, a flagrant breach of every rule of propriety she had ever known. To go to an isolated ranch with a strange man, it was madness. And yet, what was the alternative? The freezing station, the unforgiving streets of a frontier town where she knew no one. The smaller of the two girls, the one with a tiny freckle beneath her right eye, slipped her hand into Eleanor's. "Please come," she said, her voice soft but earnest. "We'll be good, won't we, Clara?" Clara nodded vigorously. "Very good, the best ever." Eleanor looked down at their hopeful faces, then back to their father. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a kind of weary recognition, the look of a man who also knew what it was to have the world fall out from under him. 2 weeks, she heard herself say the words, a surprise even to her. A trial period. For both of us to decide if the arrangement is suitable. A wave of relief washed over Garrett Sullivan's face, smoothing some of the tired lines. Fair enough. My wagon's outside. We should leave now before the storm gets worse. As Eleanor followed the Sullivan family out into the swirling snow, while the flimsy telegram slipped from her numb fingers, a gust of wind caught it, sending it tumbling into the white darkness. She didn't look back. Some messages weren't worth keeping. The first few days at Sullivan Ranch were a study in harsh realities and unspoken grief. The house itself was solid and surprisingly comfortable, built of sturdy logs with a massive stone fireplace that was its beating heart. Yet it was a house steeped in absence. Rebecca Sullivan's presence lingered everywhere, in the carefully embroidered cushions on the chairs, the collection of well-worn poetry books on a shelf in the parlor, the sad, distant look that sometimes clouded Garrett's eyes when he looked at his daughters. Eleanor's primary obstacle was not the physical hardship of ranch life, but the formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Mitchell. A woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair, pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She was Rebecca's aunt, and she guarded the family's memory with the ferocity of a she-bear. The girls need routine, not novelty, Mrs. Mitchell stated on Eleanor's first morning, her tone leaving no room for argument. Breakfast at 7, lessons from 9 to noon dinner, then nap time. No exceptions. Eleanor, accustomed to the more flexible pedagogy of her Boston school, found the rigid structure stifling, but she held her tongue. She understood that Mrs. Mitchell's coldness was a shield, her rigid adherence to routine a way of holding a grieving household together. Winning her trust would be a marathon, not a sprint. The twins, however, were a different matter. They were bright, inquisitive, and starved for the kind of focused attention their busy father and grieving great-aunt couldn't always provide. Eleanor quickly abandoned the dry primers, taking their lessons out of the small parlor Garrett had designated as a schoolroom, and into the world of the ranch itself. They learned arithmetic by counting new calves, botany by identifying the hardy spring wildflowers pushing through the last of the snow, in geography by tracing the path of Sullivan Creek on a hand-drawn map. Garrett observed these unorthodox methods with a quite appreciative watchfulness. He rarely spoke of Eleanor's teaching, but she would often look up from a lesson in the barn or by the creek to find him leaning against a fence post, a faint, sad smile on his lips. One afternoon, while searching for a spare slate in a dusty storage closet off the parlor, Eleanor stumbled upon a small, leather-bound chest. Inside, nestled amongst dried flowers and bundles of letters, was a worn photograph. It showed a younger, happier Garrett, his arms slung around the shoulders of another young man. They were both grinning, their faces alight, with the easy confidence of youth. The other man was handsome, with dark, intense eyes and a reckless smile. "Who is this Eleanor?" asked Garrett that evening as he cleaned a rifle by the fire. He glanced at the photograph, and a shudder came down over his face. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a familiar, haunted look. "An old friend," he said, his voice flat. His name was Daniel. "You look like you were close." "We were," Garrett said, his attention returning to the rifle with a finality that discouraged further questions. The shadow of Victor Reynolds also loomed over the ranch. Though Eleanor had yet to see him again, his presence was a constant undercurrent of tension. Ranch hands spoke of his men riding the fence line of cattle prices in Cheyenne, mysteriously dropping just as Sullivan beef was ready for market. A week into her stay, Eleanor was helping the twins press wildflowers in an old book when she noticed a business ledger left open on Garrett's desk. Her eyes, trained to scan documents for information, caught a familiar name at the top of a column. Cheyenne Bank and Trust, T. Blackwell, Mere Sounders Thrower. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked closer. The ledger detailed payments on a substantial loan, the interest rate alarmingly high. Tucked into the back of the book was a letter on the bank's official stationery signed by Thomas. It was a curt, formal denial of Garrett's request for a payment extension. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture that made her feel cold, despite the warmth of the fire. Thomas, the man who had abandoned her, was the same man squeezing Garrett financially. And Garrett had said Reynolds was using the bank to pressure him. The harassment from Reynolds' men escalated from passive surveillance to active sabotage. One morning, a section of fence on the northern pasture was found cut, allowing a dozen new calves to wander onto Reynolds' property. By the time Garrett and his men retrieved them, Reynolds had presented a bill for grazing and damages that was nothing short of extortion. Another time, a ranch hand riding near the creek found the water downstream running cloudy and foul. Upstream, they discovered the carcass of a deer deliberately thrown into the water to contaminate the supply for the Sullivan herd. Eleanor saw the toll it was taking on Garrett. The lines of weariness around his eyes deepened. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, and the weight of the world heavy on his broad shoulders. She began her own quiet investigation. She spoke to the ranch hands, listened to the town gossip when she accompanied Garrett on supply runs to Cheyenne. She learned that Victor Reynolds and his younger brother Daniel had arrived in the territory about the same time as Garrett. Daniel and Garrett had become fast friends partners in their early ventures, while Victor had remained aloof, using his family's Denver money to build his own separate empire. And then came the final devastating clue. In a box of Rebecca's old things, Mrs. Mitchell was cleaning out. Eleanor found a small, tattered newspaper clipping. It was a brief, tragic report from several years prior. Local rancher Daniel Reynolds, 25, was killed yesterday in a tragic cattle stampede during a severe thunderstorm. His partner, Garrett Sullivan, who was with him at the time, was unharmed. Daniel, the young man from the photograph, Victor Reynolds' younger brother. That evening, a storm rolled in, mirroring the one that had first brought her to the ranch. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and rain lashed against the log walls. The twins were asleep upstairs. Mrs. Mitchell had retired to her room. Eleanor found Garrett standing on the covered porch, staring out into the tempest, his face a mask of old, unresolved pain. "It's not just about the land, is it?" she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Reynolds' vendetta against you. It's about his brother. It's about Daniel." Garrett flinched as if she had struck him. He turned to face her, his blue eyes dark with a storm of their own. "You shouldn't have been digging into things that don't concern you. Everything that threatens this ranch, this family, concerns me now." She countered, her voice firm. "I found the newspaper clipping. I know Daniel was your friend, your partner. I know he died in a stampede when you were with him. And I know Victor Reynolds has been trying to destroy you ever since." Garrett ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture ragged with exhaustion. He leaned against a porch post, the fight seeming to go out of him. "You want to know the truth?" he said, his voice raw. "Fine. You deserve it, after all you've put up with here." He stared out into the rain, but Eleanor knew he wasn't seeing the storm. He was seeing the past. "Daniel and I were more than partners. We were like brothers. We started with nothing, just a handful of cattle and a belief that this land would provide for anyone willing to work it. Victor, he always looked down on us. On me especially. He thought Daniel was wasting his time with a dirt-poor rancher when he could have been using the family's money to build something grand." His voice dropped thick with a guilt that was years old but still fresh. "We were driving a small herd to market. A freak summer storm blew in, just like this one. Thunder lightning. The cattle were spooked. They started to run. We were trying to turn them when a bolt of lightning struck a tree right above us. It exploded. My horse threw me clear. Daniels. His horse went down in the middle of the herd. The ground was slick with mud. I tried to get to him, Eleanor. His voice broke. I was so close. But the cattle, they were terrified. I couldn't reach him in time. He fell silent, the only sound the drumming of the rain on the roof. Victor arrived the next day. Garrett continued his voice, barely a whisper. He looked at me. The way he looked at me, I'll never forget it. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just said, "You were his partner. You were supposed to protect him. This is on you, Sullivan, and I will spend the rest of my life making you pay for it." And he has. Eleanor's heart ached for him, for the terrible weight of guilt he had carried alone for so long. It was an accident, Garrett. A lightning strike, a stampede. It wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was devastating to witness. I was the more experienced one. I should have seen the storm coming. I should have told him to hold back. I should have done something different. 1,000 things. He shook his head. Victor is right. I was his partner, and I failed him. I let my best friend die. In that moment, Eleanor understood everything. This wasn't a war over land or water or even the memory of a woman. It was a war of revenge and redemption. Victor Reynolds was trying to tear down everything Garrett built as a twisted form of justice for his dead brother, and Garrett, trapped by his own guilt, had been letting him. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath her touch. No, she said, her voice filled with a certainty she felt to her core. You've been paying a debt you don't owe. You've let him chip away at you at this ranch because a part of you believes you deserve it. But you don't. The girls don't. This ranch doesn't. She looked up at him, her green eyes unwavering. It's time to stop paying, Garrett. It's time to fight back. The confession changed everything. A fragile but powerful alliance formed between Garrett and Eleanor, forged in shared knowledge and a common enemy. The fight for Sullivan Ranch was no longer just his burden to bear. Armed with the truth of Reynolds' motivation, Eleanor's perspective sharpened. She was no longer just a governess. She was a strategist, a partner in a war she was determined to help win. They began to fight back, not with overt aggression, but with careful, calculated moves. When Reynolds' men tried to divert a small tributary of the creek, Garrett, forewarned by Eleanor's insistence on regular patrols, was there with the local sheriff to document the attempt. When rumors of diseased Sullivan cattle began circulating in Cheyenne, Eleanor drafted a letter to the territorial newspaper, co-signed by the town veterinarian, attesting to the herd's excellent health and subtly hinting at the malicious slander being spread by less scrupulous competitors. Their growing bond did not go unnoticed. Victor Reynolds, accustomed to a passive, guilt-ridden opponent, was enraged by this new united front. He saw Eleanor not as a governess, but as a reinforcement, an unexpected variable that was disrupting his long and patient game of destruction. His tactics shifted from impersonal sabotage to direct psychological warfare. One afternoon, as Eleanor was walking with the twins near the edge of the property, Reynolds appeared on his magnificent black stallion. He didn't approach them directly, but sat watching from a distance, his presence a silent, menacing threat. Clara, ever fearless, waved. Charlotte instinctively moved closer to Eleanor, her small hand finding hers. "He's a bad man, isn't he?" Charlotte whispered. "He's a very unhappy man," Eleanor corrected gently, though a chill of unease traced its way down her spine. And unhappy men sometimes do bad things. The next day, a package arrived, delivered by one of Reynolds' men. Inside was a beautifully crafted porcelain doll for each of the girls. There was no note. The gesture was both an offering and a threat, a reminder that he could reach them, that he was always watching. Garrett, his face a thunderous mask, threw the dolls into the fire. "He will not touch my children." He growled the words, a low, dangerous promise. Not even with a gift. The final blow came not from Reynolds, but from the bank. A registered letter arrived from Cheyenne, its official seal stark and foreboding. Garrett opened it with grim resignation. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew. "Blackwell's called in the entire loan," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Citing the ranch's instability and the ongoing disputes. We have 60 days to pay the full amount or they foreclose on the entire property." The figure was staggering, an impossible sum to raise in 2 months. It was a checkmate. Reynolds and Blackwell had finally cornered them. That night, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Even the twins seemed to sense the oppressive weight of despair that had settled over their father. After putting them to bed, Eleanor found Garrett in his small office, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass on the desk beside him. He was staring at the foreclosure notice, as if trying to incinerate it with his gaze. "It's over," he said, not looking at her. "He's won. I should have taken his offer years ago. Sold the land, moved the girls somewhere else, somewhere safe." "That's the guilt talking, not you," Eleanor said, moving to stand behind his chair, her hands resting gently on his tense shoulders. "This is not over. We still have 60 days. For what a miracle," he let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "There are no miracles in this business, Eleanor. Only good years and bad ones. And this is the end of the line." "No." Her voice was firm, cutting through his despair. "It's the beginning of the real fight. We've been reacting to him defending against his moves. Now we go on the attack." Garrett finally looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a weary skepticism. "With what? We have no money, no leverage. The bank holds all the cards. We have the truth," she insisted. "And we have this." She slid a piece of paper onto the desk in front of him. It was a map of the territory she had been studying for days. "The Union Pacific is planning a new spur line from Denver. I heard the surveyors talking in town. Everyone thinks it's going north through the flatter plains. But look." She traced a line with her finger. "If they cut through the Laramie Range here, it saves them nearly 50 miles of track. It's rougher terrain, but more direct." Garrett stared at the line she had drawn. It cut directly through the northern section of his ranch, the very land Reynolds and the bank were trying to seize. "If the railroad comes through here." Eleanor continued, her voice alive with strategic energy. "This land becomes 10 times more valuable overnight. It's not just about water rights anymore, Garrett. It's about the future of this entire territory. That's what Reynolds has known all along. And if we can prove to the railroad that Sullivan Ranch is the more stable, reliable partner, then the bank will have no choice but to renegotiate." For the first time in days, a flicker of something other than despair appeared in Garrett's eyes. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on rumors and a line on a map. But it was better than surrender. He slowly pushed the whiskey bottle away and stood turning to face her. "A school teacher from Boston," he murmured, a hint of wonder in his voice. Who would have thought? He took her hands in his grip firm and steady. "All right, Miss Sinclair. Let's show Mr. Reynolds what a real fight looks like." The blizzard hit without warning, a furious white cataclysm that descended from the mountains and swallowed the world whole. It was the 60th day, the day the loan was due, the day Victor Reynolds had promised he would come to claim his prize. Inside the ranch house, every lamp was lit, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in time with the howling wind. The house groaned under the weight of the accumulating snow, with the timbers creaking like the bones of an old man. Garrett stood by the main window, a Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his face grim. His ranch hands, loyal to the last, were positioned at the other windows, their expressions equally tense. Eleanor was upstairs with the twins in their room, the sound of the wind muffled slightly by the thick log walls. She was reading to them from The Swiss Family Robinson. Her voice calm and steady, a deliberate anchor in the storm of fear that churned inside her. The girls, sensing the gravity of the day, were uncharacteristically quiet, their small bodies pressed close against her on either side. "Is Mr. Reynolds coming to visit?" Clara asked, her blue eyes wide. "He might," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. "But Papa is here. We're all safe." A grandfather clock in the downstairs hall ticked with agonizing slowness, each second a small hammer blow against the taut silence between gusts of wind. Garrett had sent their final desperate proposal to the Union Pacific a week ago, a detailed plan outlining the benefits of routing the spur line through their property. They had received no reply. He had tried to reason with Blackwell one last time, but the banker, clearly acting on Reynolds' orders, had been immovable. The deadline was absolute. Just after dusk they appeared, dark figures on horseback materializing out of the swirling snow like phantoms. There were 6 of them, led by Victor Reynolds, his face a pale oval beneath the brim of his snow-dusted hat. They didn't ride to the door. They fanned out surrounding the house. The standoff began. No words were exchanged. The wind was the only voice shrieking its fury. Garrett watched Reynolds, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. This was it. The culmination of years of guilt, grief, and simmering hatred. Upstairs, the strain was becoming unbearable. Charlotte began to cry softly. "I'm scared," she whispered. "It's all right, sweetheart," Eleanor soothed, pulling the quilt tighter around them. "We just need to be brave for a little while longer." She needed a distraction, something to take their minds off the terrifying shapes moving in the blizzard outside. "I know," she said with forced brightness. "Let's find that old music box of your mama's. A little music might make us feel better." She remembered seeing it in a large cedar chest at the foot of Rebecca's old bed, a chest filled with keepsakes Mrs. Mitchell had never had the heart to empty. She led the girls into the master bedroom, which had remained largely untouched since Rebecca's passing. The room was cold, the air still faintly scented with the dried lavender Rebecca had loved. Eleanor lifted the heavy lid of the chest. Inside lay neatly folded linens, a wedding veil yellowed with age, and a stack of leather-bound journals. As she searched for the music box, her fingers brushed against a false bottom. Curious, she pressed down. A section of the chest's floor clicked and lifted, revealing a hidden compartment. And inside, a single sealed envelope. On the front, in Rebecca's elegant fading script, were 2 words: "For Garrett." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was something private, something Rebecca had intended only for her husband. But the circumstances, the men outside, the imminent threat. Instinct told her this was important. "Here's the music box," she said, her voice a little too loud, as she pulled it from the main compartment and handed it to Clara. "Why don't you 2 take it back to your room and see if you can make it play?" Once the girls were gone, Eleanor carefully lifted the letter from its hiding place. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. This felt like a sacrilege, a violation of the most sacred privacy. But Garrett was downstairs preparing to face a man he believed he had wronged, a man driven by a grief Garrett felt responsible for. If this letter held anything that could help him, she had to know. She unfolded the pages. "My dearest Garrett," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am gone. Know that my last thoughts were of you and our precious girls. Know that the years we had together were more than I ever deserved. But I cannot leave this world with a lie resting on your soul. A lie you have carried for my sake, for the sake of a memory. It is time for the truth, my love. The truth about Daniel. Eleanor's breath hitched. She read on her eyes flying across the page. I was there that day, Garrett. You never knew. I had ridden out to surprise you and Daniel with a picnic. I was on the ridge above the canyon when the storm hit. I saw everything. I saw the lightning strike. I saw your horse throw you. And I saw Daniel. Oh, my love, I saw Daniel. He wasn't trying to turn the herd. He was laughing, spurring his horse on, riding into the heart of the stampede. He was reckless, always so reckless. He thought it was a game, a challenge. He wasn't thrown. He rode directly into the path of the lead steer, as if daring it to swerve. It wasn't your fault. You took the blame to protect his memory, to spare his family the shame of his foolish pride. You told me you were honoring your friend, and I loved you for it. But that honor has become a prison of guilt, a weapon Victor now uses against you. You do not let your noble lie destroy the beautiful life we built. You owe Daniel's memory nothing more. You owe our daughters a future. Forgive yourself, my love. Live. Be happy. That is all I've ever wanted for you. All my love forever, Rebecca. The letters slipped from Eleanor's fingers. The entire conflict of the years of guilt, Reynolds' righteous vengeance, it was all built on a foundation of lies. Garrett hadn't failed his friend. He had protected him even in death. A gunshot shattered the night. Then another. The attack had begun. Eleanor's mind raced. She had to get this letter to Garrett. He was down there fighting a ghost, battling a man whose entire crusade was a fraud. This truth would change everything. It would free him. Clutching the letter, she ran from the room, her only thought to reach him, to give him the one weapon that could truly win this war, before Reynolds and his men silenced them all for good. In the aftermath, the silence was as profound as the blizzard's fury had been. Victor Reynolds, wounded in the arm and defeated in spirit, had been taken into custody by the sheriff, who had arrived with a posse just as the tide was turning. His men had scattered, their loyalty evaporating with their leader's power. The storm had passed, leaving the world pristine and white, under a sky scrubbed clean and filled with stars. Inside the ranch house, the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, spent adrenaline, and the overwhelming quiet of survival. Garrett sat at the long dining table, Rebecca's letter spread out before him. He had read it 3 times, his face, a canvas of shifting emotions, disbelief, shock, and finally, a slow dawning liberation. The guilt he had carried for years, a physical weight that had stooped his shoulders and shadowed his eyes, was lifting, dissolving into the quiet aftermath of the battle. Eleanor sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee she didn't taste, giving him the space he needed to process the revelation. The twins, exhausted but safe, were asleep upstairs under the watchful eye of Mrs. Mitchell. Finally, Garrett looked up, his blue eyes clear in a way she had never seen before. All these years, he said, his voice husky. All these years I let him do this to us because I thought I owed him. I thought I owed Daniel. You owed him nothing but the friendship you gave him, Eleanor said softly. You honored his memory with a terrible sacrifice, Garrett. You carried a burden that was never yours to bear. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture weary but no longer desperate. Rebecca, she saw it all. and she let me carry it because she knew my own stubborn pride wouldn't have it any other way. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. She knew me so well. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, placing it over his heart. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "You risked everything to bring me this. You saved more than just the ranch tonight. You saved me." The raw sincerity in his voice was more intimate than any touch. In the crucible of the past hours, the final barriers between them had burned away. They were no longer just an employer and a governess, or even a man and a woman falling in love. They were partners, survivors, who had faced down the ghosts of the past together and won. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm and steady. "What you said before," he began, his voice low, "about starting over, about fighting back. It wasn't just talk. You've done it every step of the way. You've become the heart of this ranch, the heart of this family." "I found my home here," she replied simply, her fingers lacing with his. "I was just protecting it." "Our home," he corrected gently. The word hung in the air between them, a promise of a future they had earned. The fight was over. The long, difficult process of healing, of rebuildings, was about to begin. But they would do it together, their partnership solidified by trust, shared survival, and the profound, quiet truth that had finally been brought into the light. Months later, the ranch was thriving. The late summer sun beat down on fields of tall golden grass, and the cattle were fat and ready for the autumn market. The railroad spur was under construction, its distant sounds a rhythm of progress that promised a new era of prosperity. In the small local church filled with the entire community, Garrett Sullivan and Eleanor Sinclair were married. The twins, dressed in matching white dresses with blue sashes, served as their bridesmaids, their faces beaming with an uncomplicated joy that filled the room. Eleanor wore a simple cream-colored dress, far more beautiful to her than the elaborate silk gown she had once brought west. This dress symbolized a future built on truth and shared struggle, not on hollow promises. That evening, back at the ranch, the main room was filled with the warm glow of lamplight and the quiet contentment of family. The twins were finally asleep, exhausted by the day's excitement. Garrett and Eleanor stood before the great stone fireplace, the heart of their home. Garrett held a well-worn book of Byron's poetry, the one that had belonged to Rebecca. He placed it carefully on one end of the mantel. "To honor the past," he said softly, his eyes meeting Eleanor's, "and the love that built this house." Eleanor then took out the silver locket Thomas had given her. She had polished it until it shone, a relic of a past that no longer held any pain, only the memory of a path that had unexpectedly led her home. She placed it on the other end of the mantel. "To embrace the future," she said, her voice clear and sure, "and the journey that brought us together." Finally, Garrett brought forward a newly framed photograph taken on their wedding day. It showed the four of them, Garrett strong and smiling, Eleanor radiant by his side, and Clara and Charlotte nestled between them, their faces bright with happiness. He placed it in the center of the mantel between the book and the locket, bridging the past and the future with the vibrant reality of the present. The simple symbolic act spoke of justice found, of loyalty rewarded, and of a redemption that had come not through vengeance, but through forgiveness and the courage to build a new life from the ashes of the old. As they stood admiring their work, a final letter which had arrived that afternoon with the mail lay on a nearby table. It was from the Union Pacific, officially confirming the final route for the new railroad spur and outlining the generous terms of their partnership, securing their family's prosperity for generations to come.